Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And hey, I appreciate so very, very much you tuning in. If you have not subscribed yet, let me ask you to please do so. We have reached my goal of having 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year. So here we are, and admittedly, boy, August is almost gone. Can you believe this? August is almost gone, so we're getting ready to go in the ninth month, and so we set another goal of 10,500 by the end of this year. Now we haven't quite reached 10,100 as of a week ago, and I haven't looked at it a little bit, but we were at like something like 10,025, I don't know, something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but it continues to grow. That's the marvelous thing about it. Would I love to have 100,000 subscribers? Oh my goodness, yes, I would, because that would be 100,000 hearts and minds listening to the message of the faithfulness of God. You know, the Lord grant me good health, cognition, at least some. I'm going to keep on doing this. I'm going to keep on sharing the marvelous message of God's faithfulness. And in spite of all the detractors, kind of like, August the 10th, I had this debate with a, quote, former Christian, and he had no arguments. I'll have more to say about it as we continue here. But nonetheless, he literally had he had one argument that was absolutely, totally irrelevant to the proposition. He violated his own word. I'll just put it bluntly. He lied. He lied to me. He lied to the moderator. And he expects people to think that he's an honorable person. That's just really sad. I mean, it's just really, really sad. So anyway, we're growing in spite of all those kind of detractors who make these non-relevant, emotional-based arguments, and they just keep hammering on them and hammering on them and claiming, oh, all sorts of people are turning from preterism because of Preston. No, that's not true. He makes the claim, but he never justifies it. So anyway, as I promised you last Friday, all right, we were discussing the Abrahamic inheritance promise. God promised Abraham, in you and your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. God promised Abraham that he would inherit the world, the cosmos. Romans 4:13. God promised Abraham to give him a heavenly city, a heavenly country, and a better resurrection. Now, let me ask you a real quick question again that I've been posing, and I want you to think about this very clearly. And I want you to think about it versus, analytically. If, in fact, the heavenly city and the heavenly country is not a geographical, dirt-based, materialistic city and country, then upon what basis do we say that the resurrection is of biological bodies coming out of the grave? The resurrection would be of the same nature as the city and as the country. The city and the country is heavenly. It's not material. It's not dirt. It's not a city that is physical in any shape, form, or fashion. So that forces us to put the resurrection within that same kind same kind of definition. If not, why not? So last week, I shared with you, after sharing with you a couple of different programs on when the Abrahamic promise was to be fulfilled according to Revelation. Now I want to go back to the Old Testament as I promised, and I want to examine Isaiah. Now, once again, ladies and gentlemen, keep in mind how the Bible defines the Abrahamic promise, inheritance promise. Okay? The world, a city, a country, a resurrection. Keep those things paramount in your mind. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 64. Now, before we begin this exegesis, and I promise you we're going to do kind of a deep dive in Isaiah about the new heaven and the new earth. Well, wait a minute, new heaven and a new earth. I wonder if that new earth is the land, the heavenly country that God promised Abraham. Well, of course it is. Matter of fact, I'm not aware of very many commentators that would even think about denying that. It's all related to the Abrahamic promise. So we have to go back to see how the Old Testament develops this Abrahamic promise. All right. In Isaiah chapter 64, I told you we'd get to 65 and 66. Well, we got to go back to chapter 64 because it lays the foundation. It's part of the overall context of chapter 64 and chapter 65. Let me illustrate very quickly. Chapter 65, the day of the Lord, in flaming fire would bring in the new heaven, new earth. Chapter 64, verse 1 and 2 talks about the coming of the day of the Lord. These are not two totally separate, disparate days of the Lord at radically different times of radically different natures. So, Isaiah 64. And the prophet, on the behalf of Israel, cries out to Yahweh. Why? Because Israel is depicted as being oppressed with no righteousness. Chapter 64 will tell us all of our, it's interesting, righteousnesses are as filthy rags before you. The language there is really graphic. They are as menstrual rags. Yeah. And so here is Israel being depicted as having no righteousness. Now, keep that concept of righteousness, keep that in paramount in your mind as well, because when we come to 2 Peter chapter 3 and its application of Isaiah chapter 65 or 64 through 66, we're going to see a contrast between Isaiah's people with no righteousness under law versus the new heaven and the new earth, the Abrahamic promise, wherein dwells righteousness. Now, in a nutshell, and in a thumbnail sketch, what that means is this is a contrast between the old law, life under the old law, life under the old creation, and yes, life under the old law was the old creation. Just read Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11. The writer of Hebrews emphatically calls life under the old covenant as, quote, this creation, unquote. I mean, that's incredible. But I tell you, many commentators just almost gloss right over it. And they don't apply it to the doctrine of the new heaven and new earth, the old creation. Just like it doesn't even exist. So, that's the context of Isaiah 64. The people are laboring because they cannot attain to righteousness. You can go back to Isaiah chapter 59, in which the writer says, we looked for righteousness and found none. All throughout the prophetic books, you find this theme of Israel under law, struggling under vanity, striving to achieve righteousness under and through the law. and never achieving it. But the promise that in the new creation, righteousness would be the order of the day. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Okay, Isaiah 64, verse 1 and 2. Oh, that you would come down. Excuse me. Oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down, that the mountains might flow down at your presence. In other words, the mountains might melt under your presence. Now, the word presence there is in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The word that is translated as presence is the Greek word prosopon. Prosopon means face, and thus, metaphorically, presence. You can't have the face without the presence, right? Prosopon is, in my personal estimation, the twin brother, or twin sister, if you please, of parousia. The Greek word parousia, used in the New Testament, means presence. So you have prosopon, Septuagint of the Old Testament, speaking of God's presence, and you have parousia in the New Testament, speaking of the presence of God or the presence of Christ. That's why I say they're twin brothers. You can't draw any sharp distinction between prosopon and parousia. So in other words, Isaiah is praying for God to come in his presence, his parousia. Just like the New Testament writers, in predicting the day of the Lord, were predicting the parousia. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, specifically. Do you catch that? Folks, it's really, really, really important that you see this context of what the writer, Isaiah, is praying for. He is waiting for the parousia, he is praying for the parousia to do what? To make his name known among the nations. Verse 2. So, once again, let me just read verse 1 again. Oh, that you would rend the heavens. Oh, that you would come down, that the mountains might flow at your presence, as when the melting fire burns. The fire causes the water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations may dwell, or may marvel or tremble at your prosopon. Now, do you suppose, let me interject this, do you suppose that the writer at this point is asking for God to literally, may I use the term physically, I know God is a spirit, I'm using that term accommodatively. Do you think that the prophet is asking for God to bodily, visibly come out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man, perhaps? No. Now, how do I know that? And folks, this is, I'm telling you, the very first time that I read Isaiah 64, 1 to 3, we haven't got to verse 3 yet, all right? I mean, I was literally just staggered. You should be. You know why? Well, let's read it together, shall we? Verse 3, when you did, past tense, when you did terrible things for which we did not look for, you came down. I've got to point this out. Some years ago, one particularly outspoken opponent of covenant eschatology, i.e., full preterism, he actually wrote a book, or he had a lectureship speech that was published in a book. And he was attacking covenant eschatology as heretical, and it's a false doctrine. It's this and it's that. And he said, "Now look, I understand. I understand that in the Old Testament it talked about God coming. I understand that in the Old Testament you have the day of the Lord. But," he said, "when it's talking about the end of time and it's talking about the second coming of Christ, there's a sharp distinction," he said. "When it's talking about the historical days of the Lord, when God would use this nation to judge another nation, like God used Assyria to judge Egypt, when God used Babylon to judge Judah, when God used Assyria to judge the 10 northern tribes." He said, "I understand. I understand that those are called the day of the Lord." But he said, the Bible never, ever, emphasis, bold caps, underline. I don't know if he underlined it or not, but you get the point. Emphasize this. The Bible never, when it's talking about those historical events, never says God came down. When I read that, I go, oh, this is what you call an argumentum ad desperatum. For those of you who may be new to my channel, please subscribe. Argumentum ad desperatum is a non-Latin, you catch that? A non-Latin, quote, Latin, unquote, term that I invented years and years ago. Again, it's not a Latin term, but I invented it in the form of Latin to describe the utter desperation of the enemies of truth. And I'm not trying to be unkind. Many of them don't mean to be the enemy of truth, but if you resist the truth in spite of the evidence, then you wind up being the enemy. That's not a good position to be in. So anyway, argumentum ad desperatum is, in other words, an argument from desperation. And my definition of that, when people see their traditional, maybe family paradigm crumbling before their eyes, all of a sudden they start making up arguments out of pure desperation that essentially nobody has ever made in the history of Christianity. Argumentum ad desperatum. That's what it is. So here's this preacher, and by the way, at the time that he made that, he was a fairly prominent minister in the churches of Christ. He was speaking on a major lectureship forum, and it's in the book. In all of the Old Testament, when it's speaking about God using one nation to judge another, it never, ever, ever says God came down. Let me see here. When you did terrible things, for which we did not look, you came down. And by the way, in Micah chapter 1, a prediction of the destruction of the 10 northern tribes at the hands of the Assyrians, the Lord came down and he walked on the tops of the mountains, and the mountains melted under his feet, etc., etc., etc. So this, quote, scholar, unquote, pretty clearly had not done his homework. Now, what do we have here? We have Israel laboring under the law. You have Israel without righteousness, under the law. You have Israel crying out for deliverance because they've sinned and now in the historical context of Isaiah, they're in bondage. They're in captivity. They are dead. Not biologically, but positionally, relationally, they're dead before God. I mean, after all, how can they be crying out to God, oh, that you would rend the heavens, oh, that you would come down, if they're biologically dead? You know, just doesn't work. So when we look at the chapter of Isaiah 64, I want you to notice a lot of the other things that it says. Verse 4, for since the beginning of the world, man have not heard nor perceived by ear, neither has the eye seen, or, O God, besides you, what you have prepared for those who wait for him. In other words, the prophet is saying, we know that you've got something in store for us. We just wish you'd do something about it now. You meet him that rejoices and works righteousness, those that remember thee in your ways. Behold, you are wrathful, for we have sinned. In those is continuance, and that is in righteousness and rejoicing in righteousness. In those we will continue, he says, oh, we will seek that and we shall be saved. But we are all as an unclean thing. All our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. We all fade away as a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, have taken us away. They're in bondage. They're in captivity. They are alienated from God. They are dead. And there is none that calls upon your name, that stirs up himself to take hold of thee. For you have hid your face from us, and you have consumed us because of our iniquities. What has God done? You have hidden your face, prosopon. Now, let me ask you to consider something. I'm running out of time, but all of this is necessary as a lead-in for understanding 65 and 66. Remember, oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down, that you would make your presence, prosopon, known to the nations, that they might tremble at your prosopon. Once again, was Isaiah praying for God to come out of heaven in some visible manifestation from heaven? Now, at this point, let me remind you that on August the 10th of this year, 2025, I had a formal YouTube debate with a man by the name of Tristan Gabriel. He was once a youth minister, seminarian graduate, etc., etc. Now he's a skeptic. I think, for all practical purposes, he's an atheist. Because he says, number one, yes, Jesus predicted to come back in the first century. He predicted the resurrection would be at the time of the fall of Jerusalem, but his prophecies failed. How can you be any kind of a believer and deny that Jesus kept his word? I mean, you can talk about, oh, well, no, I've sort of kind of got some kind of a belief in this and that and the other. Well, you don't believe the Bible. If you admit that Jesus predicted those things for the first century, but he didn't do it, you don't believe the Bible. You don't believe in Jesus. You don't believe in God. So all of the talk that this gentleman, well, he's not actually a gentleman, to be honest about it, but nonetheless, that this fella claims to believe in somehow, some way, and turn right around and say Jesus was a liar. Jesus failed. That's illogical. But then again, virtually everything that he said in the debate was illogical. Jesus lied. Jesus failed. Even though he said his coming and the resurrection was to be in the first century, he failed. Now, why is he saying that? Because he said the first century saints were expecting Jesus to come out of heaven, literally, visibly, bodily, as a 5'5" Jewish man, as I like to express it. Well, Jesus didn't come like that. Therefore, the argument was, well, he never really made that argument succinctly. He had one emotional-based argument that was not even relevant to the subject of the debate. And he just made the same argument for 4 hours. 4 hours. Wasn't a valid point, was not a biblical point, was not an exegetical point. He gave no syllogism, but he claims that he won the debate. Yeah, pure emotionalism. But here's the point. This fella says the expectation of the first century church was for a literal parousia, a literal, visible, tangible, reach out and touch it kind of event. Well, I think everyone agrees Jesus did not come out of heaven literally, visibly, bodily, tangibly, where you could reach out and touch him with your hands. This is the point that I made from my very first presentation to the end of the debate, 4 hours of the debate. I made this point over and over and over again. Now, here's the point that I made in the debate at least 2 or 3 times. Please follow me here. That fellow never followed me. He ignored my argument. Again, I made it, I think, 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. So even though I made the argument something like 2 or 3 times, he didn't touch it, top, side, or bottom. He refused to acknowledge it. The coming of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3, to bring in the new heaven and new earth, the Abrahamic promise, would be in fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 64 and 65. But the coming of the Lord of Isaiah 64, 65 would not be a literal, visible coming of God out of heaven. Therefore, the coming of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3 to bring in the new heaven and new earth would not be a literal, visible, bodily coming of Christ out of heaven. Do you catch the power of that? He caught the power of it. That's why he ignored it. I'm out of time. Think about that. Until next week.